in Michigan. This was prior to the realization that we had them breeding here in Wisconsin. So that we have that as an interesting and important topic tonight. Our speaker, Joel Trick, received his bachelor's and master's degrees in biology from UW Green Bay. We'll forgive him that here. And he spent over 20 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, mostly with, as I understand it, endangered species, gray wolf, whooping crane, piping plover, bald eagle, and Kirtland's warblers. So without any further ado, join me in welcoming Joel to Aldo Leopold Ottoman.
Well, thank you. I'll tell you just briefly a little bit about myself. I'm a native Wisconsinite, born in Racine, but I've lived in the Green Bay area for going on 50 years now. So I'm almost a Green Bay native. And I've always been interested in birds, and so it was a natural for me to work on some of the birds I did as an endangered species biologist. I'm going to talk about the Kirtland's warbler in Wisconsin. I'll give you a little background, first of all, on the history and ecology of the species. Yeah, could we get some lights? And I'll say, I've given this talk many times, or quite a few times, but in the same sense, I've never given this talk, because it's always changing, always evolving. I'm shooting for about an hour. I'm likely to be short or long on that. I hope you will bear with me on that. There's a lot of information. As we've gone on in the years of the project, I've had to now start summarizing some of this stuff rather than giving a rundown of every year. But the Kirtland's warbler, let's see if I got this right, okay, is the largest member of the genus. In fact, it used to be in Dendroica. It's recently been put in another genus, Setophaga. But it's characterized, it's a fairly large warbler, characterized by a blue-gray upper side heavily streaked with black, bright yellow chest with streaking at the sides, a broken white eye ring, and a black mask. And this is the plumage of an adult male. Females are very similar, but just drabber in every respect, tend to have more fine streaking across the breast, less brilliant yellow breast, has that broken white eye ring, but it lacks the black mask. And here's a video to give you a feel for the song. Very loud, ringing song. Can be heard easily in good conditions at a quarter of a mile, often given from the top of a tree like this. The species is named after a gentleman by the name of Kirtland, who was a doctor and scientist in Ohio in the 1800s. It was the first specimen of the species was collected on his farm, and it was named after him by his friend Spencer Bear. The discovery of the wintering grounds didn't occur until 1879, and virtually all the birds winter in the Bahamas. And in 1903 is when they first discovered a nest of the species and the nesting grounds in northern lower Michigan. This gives you an idea of the general distribution of the species. This is actually 2007 data, and you'll see that the northern lower Michigan is basically where the population is concentrated. Birds are at scattered sites in the UP. They've been breeding there since 1995. And then, of course, this represents 2007 when we first found birds in Wisconsin. They make a round trip to the wintering area in the Bahamas every year, twice a year, about 3,000 miles round trip. The habitat they select for breeding consists of large stands of young jack pine, about 5 to 25 years of age, generally 5 to 20 feet in height. They generally prefer larger stands, greater than 1,000 acres, and they prefer dense stocking and scattered openings. And those are two characteristics that actually are different from what we get in most of our managed forests. The habitat they occur in, jack pine or pine barrens, typically occurs on sandy outwash plains, which are often very low relief and excessively well-drained soil. And typically, historically, naturally, this habitat is naturally regenerated by stand replacing fire, resulting in even-age stands of rather extensive. And this would be, historically, the landscape when fire was a major component of ecological, functionality. In our modern society, we manage against fire in large part. But typically, on the last slide, I talked about the fact that the stands typically have dense stands with scattered openings, which is the kind of heterogeneous habitat that you get with a naturally regenerated fire. This is the type of opening that occurs within these stands that the Kirtlands really apparently depend upon and really focus on. Nearly all of the nests are located in or near these openings. The birds nest on the ground, typically 5 eggs, speckled brown, often concealed in blueberry, as is the case here. Historically, we have little information. The bird has always been rare. We don't have great natural history information going back into the 18th century and the 19th century. But we could estimate that there was probably a greater extent of habitat historically, particularly around the logging era in the late 19th century, when there was large-scale deforestation and large-scale fire on the landscape. So there was probably a lot of good habitat. But then in the mid-1930s and 40s, you're all familiar with Smokey the Bear, where our society really put a premium on fire suppression. And so those fires that formerly regenerated jack pine habitat basically were not allowed to occur in many areas, resulting in a great loss of habitat. Well, the species has always been recognized as being rare. And back in 1951, they conducted the first census to try to actually count how many birds there are in the population. They wanted to get a handle on that. They made their best effort and counted 432 singing males in 1951. They repeated that census 10 years later in 1961, and the population was similar, about 500 singing males. Another 10 years go by, they repeated in 1971, lo and behold, the population is now 200 males. Something's going on here. So it really triggered some response and concern to try to do something about this. And this is about when they introduced habitat management, trying to actually create habitat that species was perceived as required. And mostly in the form of mechanical harvest, but fire was used quite a bit too. Another action that was taken at that time is that the nesting areas where birds occur was closed to the public during the nesting season. And as I showed you before, this bird is a ground nester, and if you're birders at all, a lot of people really want to see this bird. So we really want to avoid crowds of people trouncing around out in the landscape and potentially adversely affecting nesting. So this was one of the steps that was taken, and it continues today. And about this time, they also recognized that cowbird nest parasitism was a real concern for the species. It was really affecting the species. You're probably familiar with the brown-headed cowbird. In 1972, we initiated cowbird trapping, and that has continued to date. And these traps are placed in and near the nesting areas. Basically, they're a cage trap that has large enough mesh on the top so that birds can drop in, but really they cannot fly out because their wings are spread when they're flying. And they're baited then with live cowbirds that are provided food and water, and then operated through the season to try to remove cowbirds, or at least depress the population of cowbirds in the vicinity of the nesting areas. So here's another graphic of the census. 1972 is when we instituted cowbird trapping. Well, come to find out, that didn't really have the kind of response that we were looking for. We were probably holding our own at this point, obviously, but we did not really get the great response that everybody had hoped for. And so, in 1986, there was an event called the Mac Lake Fire, where there was a prescribed burn that got out of control, ended up burning like 20,000 acres. One person died, and lost a dozen homes were destroyed. But the upshot of that being is that it regenerated a huge area of Kirtland's warbler habitat. And so we get all these young trees popping up in this area. Within 5-6 years, suitable habitat for Kirtland's warblers, and boy did they respond. This is just the Mac Lake Burn area, which is actually a tiny fragment of the entire range of the species. But if you remember from that last graphic, we're bumping along at about 200 males for the entire population. This is the Mac Lake Burn, and how many birds are just in the Mac Lake Burn area. They really responded. When we produced that big gob of habitat, they really came through. And so you can see just in that area here, by the time the habitat is peaking in 1994, we got about 300 males out there. And this is, I'll just point out here too, this really gives a good picture for how these birds utilize the habitat. They come in when it's about 4, 5, 6 years old. That's when it becomes first suitable. Trees are 5, 6 feet tall. When they're 10 to 12 to 15 feet tall, that's optimal habitat. As they grow beyond that, it becomes suboptimal and usage drops off to nothing. By the time the stand is 25 years old, there's no more Kirtlands nesting there. And here's a graphic that shows the long-term trend of the population with that Mac Lake Burn superimposed in here, down here. And you can see that the Mac Lake Burn basically started a population increase that has continued today. Now this graphic only goes through 2000. I'll show you another one here that goes a little bit further. So currently, we not only trap for cowbirds, but we manage for habitat on state and federal land, mostly in Michigan. And there's enough land base in that management scheme to provide 38,000 acres of suitable habitat in any one year. There's 190,000 acres that are suitable to this management. But remember, they're only utilizing those stands that are basically 5 to 20 years of age. But you need to grow those trees beyond 20 years of age to make it economically viable. So after the trees are 25 years old, the Kirtlands are using it, but the trees are allowed to mature to some, a harvest date of 40, 50, 60 years. I think it depends on the ownership. And then here's another graphic showing that trend continuing here right through 2011. So for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been sitting up there about 1,800 males. That's for the total world population. Now I'm going to talk about Kirtlands in Wisconsin. You've got the background on the species. In Wisconsin, there is quite a number of historic records through time. 9 records prior to 1978 in 9 different counties, all during migration periods. A systematic search in 1978 was conducted, and they found a single bird in Jackson, another one in Juneau counties, and then in Jackson County, birds were seen the next 2 years as well. Another statewide survey conducted in 1988 found 8 males, 2 Douglas, 2 in Washburn, 4 in Jackson County. And then went through a period from 88 to 2006. Birds were reported a little more frequently in 11 years out of that 19-year span in at least 8 counties. Multiple birds in Jackson County in 05 and 06. No females. No females had ever been seen in Wisconsin during the breeding season. 1 female record historically back in the early 1900s, but it was in migration. And I'll note that this increase in sightings was coincident with that population growth that you saw in that graph. 2007, this is when everything changed. May 19th, 3 male Kirtlands discovered down here in Adams County. And May 28th, 3 more birds at another site about a mile from there. And this is the gentleman that actually found the birds most recently, 2007, Dean DiTomaso, an avid birder who worked as an environmental compliance monitor for a major pipeline, but he just did a lot of birding on his own. He found these birds, and was able to continue monitoring them for us. And the site where they're found, both these sites are red pine plantations owned by Plum Creek Timber Company. Historically, you know, Kirtland's warblers prefer jack pine, and that's the habitat they occur in. In this case, they're occurring in a red pine plantation, but for those of you who may be able to recognize this, there's a lot of what we call volunteer jack pine in this stance. And also, there's a lot of these little openings where a lot of those red pines didn't do so well, creating the exact conditions we're looking for in Kirtland's habitat. Dense stocking with jack pine, but scattered openings, which to a forester is unproductive ground. And June 2nd, Dean found the first female, and June 5th, the first nest. There's the first nest found in Wisconsin of the Kirtland's warbler. So through the season in 2007, I was able to get Dean to continue some monitoring in his spare time, and he gave us a little more information. Was able to document at least 8 males and 3 females at these 2 sites, all in Adams County, and at least 3 nests. 2 of those we know were lost to cowbird parasitism. The 3rd one we don't know, and in part because we were very cautious. But this was the first confirmed nesting in Wisconsin. So we immediately began planning for the next year. Working with my DNR counterpart, we wanted to respond to this and try to figure out, okay, what are we going to do for next year? First of all, statewide surveys. It turns out this was already in the works, but it kind of highlighted the idea that, you know, there may be Kirtland's nesting out there someplace else that we haven't found. So we wanted to kind of scope out the best habitat areas, see if we can find more birds. We also want to do cowbird trapping, you know, to emulate what's been done in Michigan. It's been effective there, and we thought it would be a good idea, given that at least 2 of the 3 nests that we had were lost to cowbirds. And I don't know how much you guys know about that, but you know, when cowbirds lay their eggs in a nest, the chances of the host bird's nestlings surviving are very slim, pretty much nil. Well, I also want to do monitoring at this Adams County site, you know, to know more about it. How many birds are there? How many females? How many nests are there? Did we get the complete picture? Are they actually being successful? And then we wanted to do color banding. We're going to capture these birds, put a unique combination of color bands on them so we can track their movements between sites, check their return rate from year to year, and it also gives us a great tool for monitoring the birds at the site to determine territories. And then the last thing that was part of our strategy is I recognize as a birder and a long-term WSO member, there's going to be some birders that really want to see Kirtland's warbler. And given the kind of, you know, modern communication technology we have, there's no way I was going to keep that secret. So I would prefer to take those birders out there under controlled conditions and let them see a bird, hopefully reduce the number of people who are going to go out there on their own and potentially adversely affect the bird. So we started planning for a field trip for WSO. Cowbird trapping, we ran 2 cowbird traps and began trapping in mid-April, went through late June, removed about 300 cowbirds between those 2 traps during that time period. Statewide surveys, 41 surveyors, 89 sites in 12 counties, and these are the counties where we identified through an analysis of forestry data to try to determine where jack pine dominated stands of a particular target age and a minimum size were located, and then send out volunteers, some of you may have been the volunteers, to go and survey these sites. And then, you know, we kind of assumed all along birds were going to come back, but, you know, we didn't really know. Well, sure enough, May 14th, the first bird was observed there. And late May, then we had our WSO field trip, which was a great success. If I remember right, we had about maybe 75 people, brought them out there in a couple of groups, and everybody got to see the bird. It was great. And then we did our color banding. By the time we got to do this, this has been early June, we already would have had a monitor on site, so she could identify where birds had localized their territories. So we were able to then target individual birds one by one and capture them. And the way we do it is we find a little avenue where we can put up a mist net, maybe clip a few limbs, try to keep it in a place where it's unobtrusive and the birds can't see it that well. Played a little recording of a Kirtland's warbler call. And almost invariably, the local male, who we've already know lives there because our monitor has found out where his turf is, comes in to find out who that male is in his territory and goes right into the mist net. This is rarest, retired Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, and bander, who comes over and assists us with the banding. He takes the lead on the banding. And then we capture the birds, take all sorts of metrics on them, including weight, wing chord, tail length, some plumage notes. We can age the bird to some degree based upon the plumage. And then they all get their unique combination of color bands, which allow us then to identify individual birds from a distance. And then it, of course, facilitates the monitoring. And this particular bird, by the way, showed up the first year. In fact, this was the very first bird we caught. He was already banded. But he had been banded in the Bahamas during the winter. There was an ongoing study in the Bahamas where they were looking at wintering habitat, and they banded quite a few birds. We've actually had 3 different Bahamas birds documented in Wisconsin. And this guy returned for the next 3 years as well. And this was our first nest monitor, Jennifer Goyette. We're kind of plowing new ground here. Hired a monitor, told her to go out and follow birds and find nests and determine outcomes. Here's a photo that she took of a bird incubating. Here's a female under that blueberry. That's what you have to be very patient to find these birds. And then here's a nest just prior to fledging. A little hard to see, but there's five little beaks in there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Interesting color center.
And then here's the first documented fledging of Kirtland's warbler in Wisconsin. So this is what they look like coming out. Many people remark they look like a little pine cone. So for 2008, that very first year, we documented at least 8 males and 5 females, 5 nesting attempts, 2 of which were successful. So the first confirmed successful nesting. We also had single birds at 2 sites in Marinette County that we managed to capture and band, and 2 more single birds in Bayfield and Douglas County, which we were not able to find in subsequent visits. So now I'm going to talk about each of those aspects of the project, but a little bit more summarizing now for the 2009 through 2012, because we've already gone 5 years under our belt on this. Cowbird trapping. Again, we've done this mid-April through late June. Through 5 years of trapping, over 1,100 cowbirds that we've reviewed. And we do this in cooperation with the USDA Wildlife Services. They actually conduct the trapping. It's another federal agency under USDA. Okay, so monitoring 2009, 2012, every year we've had the monitors basically giving them the same marching orders. Go out there and map the territory, so all the birds we have banded, search for nests, and we want to determine nest outcomes. But the caveat there on determining nest outcomes is we've tried to be very conservative. They nest on the ground. We want to avoid close approach to the nest to the extent we can. You may not know this, but a human approach to a ground nest or any nest leaves a scent trail that predators will follow, and they will find that nest. So we did everything we could not to make that happen. There's a certain amount of risk associated. We minimized it as much as we could. It also impeded our ability then to determine nest outcomes. Because of being conservative, we erred on the side of caution. Sometimes we didn't really get great resolution on what kind of fledging success we had. But we did the best we could. But this is some of the kind of stuff that we can get. This was Nick Anich. That was Nick Anich, that photo there of our first second-year monitor. And this is kind of a map that Nick put together, which shows, an aggregation of all those individual GPS locations for individual birds, which kind of gives you a feel for their territories. And one interesting story I'll just mention is, you know, I had said we have the monitor on site for a couple weeks before we go into band. He knows where the birds live, so we go right to their territory and we catch them. Well, this bird here, when we went to get him, he wasn't home. Like, what the heck? We can't find him. Well, about a week later, we figured out actually what happened. He actually had 2 territories. He had one down here and one up here, and 2 females and 2 nests. And apparently that's not that uncommon. So anyhow, we did end up catching this guy a few weeks later. And here's just another graphic from subsequent year. This is 2010. To show you a few more birds here, how they kind of really fill in that habitat. This is the primo site, at least that's the birds are telling me. And now there's a lot of information here. I apologize for that, but this is kind of a summary of everything we've had for the first 5 years of the project. Number of males, you know, 8 and 10. The last 3 years, 22 to 24 males, okay, for all of Wisconsin. And then females, never as many as males. You know, there always seems to be an excess number of males. And we were able to quantify, you know, nest attempts. You can see here, they don't have great nest success. I don't know what it means in terms of population, but it's so far so good. So we've documented at least 60 nest attempts. You know, we estimated 65 to 88 young flies out of those 60 attempts. And then for that whole period, Marinette County has kind of been our secondary site. There's great habitat up there. The county has a lot of forests that they actually manage for jackpine. They plant jackpine. We've had birds every year, and also we have a great volunteer up there who just really does a bang-up job. They've been present every year from 2008 through 2012. We actually had successful nesting in 2009, and we've had birds at least 5 locations. Other counties? Mayfield County, we've had birds at 2 locations, including 1 on the National Forest. Unfortunately, they never showed back up again. Douglas County, a number of fairly close locations, and Vilas County. There's also some pretty fair habitat in Vilas County. You know, and all of these remote sites, I guess, kind of suffer from being geographically removed from the main, at least my interpretation, from the main breeding area. So in order for one of these sites to really get going and become occupied persistently, you need to have at least a male and a female show up at the same place in the same year. And it apparently doesn't always happen. And I think it actually needs more than that. You might need a little bit more of that, of a nucleus to really hang on. But ultimately, I'm hoping that will happen, particularly in the Northwest, in Douglas and Bayfield County. There's just scads of great habitat. So we just got to get some birds up there and get them started. And I think there's a lot of promise. So here's a map that shows records here since 1988, the red dots. And then the black dots are where we've actually banded birds here during the course of our project. Statewide surveys. This has been coordinated by Kim Grebels of Wisconsin DNR. But again, this just kind of summarizes, you know, what kind of effort's going on every year. Basically from 30 to 40 volunteers every year. You know, survey between 6 and 12 counties. And as time has gone on, we've usually had birds in multiple counties every year. This last year we actually had them in 5 counties. Yeah, Adams, Mayfield, Douglas, Marinette, and Vilas. So those are kind of the historic, let me see if I can back up here. I just want to point out, this shaded area, these are the historic Barrens areas. So this is where you expect, historically, that jackpine habitat occurred. And so you would expect that that's where you're going to have the best opportunities for large-scale management, which these birds really need. And now I'll just refer back to this earlier graphic, and which you saw in a couple of ways, where we do this annual census. There's every effort to do an annual census and count how many birds there are. It's imperfect, but it gives us a measurement, something we can compare from year to year. And ever since birds started nesting in Wisconsin, we also provide data for numbers of birds in Wisconsin to the census so that it's added into the total. So these are the numbers that we report to the census, to Michigan, and you'll notice that these are slightly different from the numbers you may have saw in some of those other graphics. It's because we only report during this period from June 6 to 20. We try to do it in a defined area when birds are relatively localized to avoid counting birds twice. Because we do have birds, like we've had these birds remotely in Douglas and Mayfield counties, where they'll show up and they'll be there for a week or two and no female shows up, so they take off. They try to find another site. And so you want to try to minimize double counting those birds. So anyhow, we only report then the birds during the official census period. And here is a more up-to-date graphic. This is through 2011. Again, we got about 1,800 birds. 2012 total over 2,000.
That's a good trend.
Now, banding returns. This is kind of one of the things that is fascinating to me. You know, we not only have used color banding as a tool to monitor birds on the site and keep them separate and map their territories, but we've accumulated some information on these things through time. And I put together this little graphic to kind of show you. In 2008, we started out with, we had 8 males, but one of them showed up late, didn't really stick around, we never caught him. But all these guys we got banded. This one was already banded, the Bahamas bird. We got bands on all these guys. 2009, 5 of those 7 birds returned. Okay? And then we also banded another 5 new males in 2009, and 3 fledglings, and 1 female who just got in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah. She goes in the net, she gets bands. So in 2010, 10 out of 10 of those males returned. These are little guys, they're flying 1,500 miles to their wintering site, you know? How do they do that? I don't know. But then we banded another 8 males. So here we are with 18. 2011, 16 of 18 returned. No, I'm okay, thank you. Correct. Okay, so now, 2000, here's our 18 birds in 2011, 2012, or 20 it was, 14 and 20 in 2012, this last year. And then 6 more new males that got bracelets last year. So all years combined, 0.82 annual survival. Which is pretty darn good for a little bird like that. And I think the published value is more like about 0.75 tops. And now here, we've banded a few birds up in Merida County as well. We got 2 in 2008. 2009, 2 different birds, one of which was already banded, showed up. 2010, we had 1 bird that showed up, we caught him. And one of these guys we banded in 2008 showed up in the Raco Plains, which is in the far east end of the UP. In 2011, another new bird we caught, and that guy ended up in the Raco Plains again. And 2012, this guy came back again, and so did the guy up in the Raco Plains. So even though we banded him here, he spent, you know, at least 3 of the last 4 years up there, you know, 300 miles away. One of the questions that we have had all along is, you know, you see where every year I have these birds returning and then new birds banding. The new birds that I'm banding are second-year birds. We can look at the plumage and be pretty confident this bird was hatched a year ago. So we're getting first-year birds, 1-year-old birds that come back and we're banding them. And I suspect that those birds are largely fledged in Wisconsin and returning to their natal site. But I can't really prove that until I slap some bands on them. So we made an effort here in 2009 to ban fledglings, and just to be conservative, we decided to go in right when they're fledging from the nest, instead of when they're in the nest and really a kind of very much subject to predation. We figured we'd wait till they're out of the nest. They can't fly that good, we can catch them. Well, we spent a lot of time and effort, we managed to get 3. You know, partly because, you know, we're only talking a handful of nests, and they're not synchronous in terms of the nest, so there may only be one nest that's available now, and you've got to wait 5 days for the next one to fledge. So anyhow, long story short, those 3 birds we never saw again, unfortunately. So this last year, we geared up for another effort to try to get more bands on. And what we decided to do is wait till birds have fledged, and actually were very strong in flight, put up a whole bunch of nets out there. And just run a bunch of nets, and hopefully some of them will end up in the net. Well, we did that in late July and August last year. Unfortunately, we had this whopper drought. It was dry as heck out there. There wasn't a bug to be found. I think they left the site. We did catch 1 bird. This was a first-year bird, so we got 1 bird last year, but it was quite disappointing given the effort that we did. We're considering how we want to modify our approach this year, and I still would like to be able to target banding some fledglings before they leave here, so we know when those first-year birds come back where they originated from. The field trips, after the first year, we did another WSO field trip in 2009, and we also put together what I call the agency field trip. I wanted to get other federal and state agencies, personnel out there, to get them excited, kind of draw them into the project. In some cases, these are people who maybe have authority for management decisions on their lands, or they manage for Kirtlands. So I had a number of people out there within the DNR and other federal agencies, Forest Service and Department of Defense. And then we had field trips for Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. That organization has provided funding for our project every year, lion's share of the project, and so we've offered this field trip to NRF members for the last 3 years now, and it's always a extremely popular event. In 2010, we actually had Wisconsin Public Television out there, did a little special on that, and here they are interviewing our monitor from that year, Nick Ball. This is Nick Anich. When he was out there, another thing that we did was to sample the vegetation, to characterize what vegetation is like out there on the ground that the birds are using, so we can quantify and perhaps try to replicate that on another site. And so here we are. We did point quarter sampling. We sampled the tree layer. We also did 1 meter quadrats to look at the vegetation layer. We also did quadrats on nest sites. And this steel post here is marking the location of a nest. So that kind of gives you an idea of where these birds place their nest. It's quite often around the edge of an opening like this, often at the base of a little tree, and in this case, again, in blueberry. And then we generated a publication we actually got printed in the Wilson's Bulletin on this particular publication. But this is where I want to put my effort in the future, and that is habitat management. And so I've been starting to work on a number of different projects. The habitat that's out there is largely a matter of happenstance. There's been no strategic plan to create habitat. We know what Kirtlands want. They want these extensive jack pine stands with little openings and fairly dense stocking, and they want it in a big chunk. They want a big landscape. So there's a couple of projects that are in the works right now that we're working on. One of them is actually Plum Creek Timber Company, right adjacent to the breeding site where birds are now. There's a 300-acre site, plus another 65 acres that was recently added to that, where Plum Creek really wants to try to manage still for red pine, find a way to grow red pine while still providing habitat for Kirtlands. And so we've designed a couple of treatments. All the treatments will include openings incorporated in the stand, which we think is important. And then several of them will have different versions of jack pine mixed into the stand as well. In one case, it'll be a couple of rows of jack pine. In another case, it'll be jack pine planted around the margin of these openings. And then another site, it's just red pine and openings, and that's it. And it's kind of an experiment to see whether or not we can actually get Kirtlands to use these sites at the same time that these guys are actually commercially growing red pine. So time will tell. But that's already been harvested. The trees went in about 2 weeks ago. So in 5 years or so, we'll see what happens. Baronet County Forest, as I mentioned, these guys have a huge county forest land base, and actually a big chunk of it is jack pine, and they actually plant jack pine. A lot of the commercial forestry operations, they don't plant jack pine at all, even though it's the historic natural species that occurs on these sites. Red pine is much more, has a greater economic return. It's just a huge difference. So most places do not manage for jack pine, but Baronet County does. They recognize that the site really doesn't lend itself to red pine, and so anyhow, for whatever reason, they have a pretty good land base, and I've worked with them to develop a plan that they're already starting to implement, at least in little pieces, and we've had Kirtlands in that same area, but now we're actually going to put in some habitat and strategically locate it. Nicolay National Forest up in the Bayfield Peninsula have developed a plan. They got a couple thousand acres devoted to Kirtland's Warbler. They did a planting there last year on about 200-300 acres. There's some promise there as well. It's not the very best habitat in Wisconsin, but it's by far the best habitat on the forest. And as a federal agency, they have a much stronger direction to do things to benefit endangered species than many of these other partners. So we have a lot of latitude to get stuff done there, but they're a little bit inhibited by the fact that they don't have the very best land base for it. Not that far away from it, Bayfield County, that is the best land base. There's tens of thousands of acres of jack pine, and a lot of it's actually pretty good right now. We've had birds there pretty consistently in the last couple of years, and then I've been working with the county forest to kind of tweak their plan and incorporate KW management into their plan, and I think that's going to happen so that they will provide consistently something like 400 acres of Kirtland's Warbler habitat available in any 1 year through time. They already manage a pretty big opening. One of the characteristics I didn't really dwell on here is that Kirtland's Warblers not only like jack pine and young jack pine and large stands, but they like big open landscapes. Every place where these birds are occurring, there's like 3,000 acres of young pine. I think they can see that. It's amazing how they can actually find these sites. And just as an example, last year we banded a bird up here in Bayfield County in late May. In late June, he showed up at the Kirtland site in Adams County. These guys find this stuff, I don't know, they're just really good at it. So this is just to show you that this is the kind of management, and by the way, I didn't really talk about this before, but this is the managed habitat in Michigan. This stuff here was, I think, probably burned, but this is the way they plant it. They do these alternating wave patterns, they leave these little openings. So these are little unplanted openings. That's what their managed habitat looks like. And most of the habitat in Michigan now is managed this way, and more than 95% of the population is in this managed habitat. So they respond, they use this stuff. But some of the other species that benefit from this type of management are things like brown thrasher, vesper sparrow, towhees, nighthawks. These are all typical of these big open areas. Now for this next year, we're going to kind of do a lot of the same stuff, and I don't know if this registered, but like he mentioned, I'm retired. I retired last fall. So I'm not doing all this stuff anymore. Some of it I'm involved with yet this year, but a lot of this stuff other people are carrying on. But statewide surveys, again, are going to be conducted through using a fleet of volunteers. Cowbird trapping has already been going on for about a month, or 3 weeks. Monitoring, the monitor at the Adams County site started this week, so she's already out there. There's at least 4 birds on site right now that she told me today. Color banding, we'll be gearing up for color banding in late May after the field trips. We try to time the color banding at a time of year when we're pretty confident that all the birds have showed up, but before they really get down to business and start laying eggs. We want to try to hit that window to minimize disturbance to nesting birds, but maximize getting all the birds on site. So we usually wait, and I've done an analysis based on the data we've had. By the time we get to May 29th, about 88% of the birds that are going to show up are there. So that's about when we go. And then something that has been done the last couple of years is putting in nest cameras to try to get a better resolution on what are the causes of nest failure. As you saw, most of these nests fail, and we really don't know why. We can guess on some of this stuff, but there's been an effort the last couple of years to put in cameras at the nest to try to get greater information. But there's been difficulty with that because we want to stay far enough away that we don't cause abandonment, and then turns out you don't get that greater resolution unless you're really close. So we're still kind of trying to find that sweet spot, and that'll probably go on again this year. And then, like I mentioned, I want to make an effort to ban fledglings again. I really would like to have some of those first-year birds come back with bands on so we know where they came from. We'll see how that goes. That's a labor-intensive project, but a labor of love, too. And I need to talk about all the people involved in the project. I worked with Fish and Wildlife Service, the Endangered Species Act, federally listed species. That carried a lot of weight and, really required my involvement in this. But there's a lot of other people that contributed through time. There's no way that the Fish and Wildlife Service does this themselves. I can't say this enough. I'm given a job of recovering endangered species, and yet I am totally dependent on my partners to get the job done. Okay, I'm speaking in the past tense, but that's the reality. And of course, as you could guess, Wisconsin DNR is a big partner for us. But there's other people too I want to mention. Plum Creek Timber Company, who's been very good about allowing us to work on their lands, very cooperative. They come out on the field trips, they talk to people about forest management. It's actually a big PR plum for them. So it works both ways. They get a lot of benefit. USDA Wildlife Services, the guy who did the cover trapping, I depend on them and they always get the job done. It's really hard to measure how much impact that has. How many nests would we have lost if there were more cowbirds out there? It's really difficult to say, but we figure it's not that hard for us to do, so we're gonna keep doing it. And WSO, of course, I partner with going out there. Natural Resources Foundation, Wisconsin. Like I said, those have been our primary funding vehicle for most of the project. Work closely with them. And then, of course, the Forest Service, I'm working with them up on their lands. And actually, one of the Forest Service employees in Wisconsin is a member of the Kirtland's Warbler recovery team. And innumerable volunteers. Ron Refsnyder, our bander. This is Jack Swellstead down here on the bottom right with me. He's our volunteer up in Marinette County, a retired doctor. He puts in hundreds of hours a year finding birds and monitoring birds. Great guy to work with. I was birding with him this morning. Barry Benson, he's the USDA Wildlife Services guy, changing the water in the cowbird trap and checking those guys out. And here's just a handful of the volunteers at an appreciation event that we had who go out and do surveys for Kirtland's warblers. They've found some of these remote birds that we then chase down and slap bands on. And so they've stepped up really big. At this time, I'd be glad to answer any kind of questions you got. Yes?
Have there been any reports of the Kirtlands in Minnesota, Ontario, other than that far eastern outlier that you showed earlier?
Okay, no. I think there was a possibility of a bird more in northern Ontario, like north of Lake Superior last year, but the information was very fragmentary. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because I didn't really dwell on that, but the same year that we had birds first show up here in 2007, there were birds in eastern Ontario, it was like straight east of us, at a place, a military base called Camp Petawawa. And birds nested there that year, and they've been there every year since. 2 or 3 males every year. And that is the same location where actually recently fledged birds were found at that site in the 1940s, which was the only previously documented case of birds nesting, Kirtland's nesting, outside of Michigan, until they began nesting in Wisconsin. Yes?
What was the territory again, approximately?
I mean, the size of an individual bird territory? I don't know, like 3 to 5 to 8 acres. It varies.
Oh, it's that small.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it's not that big.
Well, we have an extensive bluebird trail, 1,300 boxes, and have spent a lot of time in especially Wood County in jack pine habitat. And we had real difficulty in that habitat in the extreme heat last year.
Yeah.
And so I heard you say that, you know, the birds tended to disappear when that drought hit. Do you get the idea that the insect availability in jack pine is really pretty modest?
I think it's pretty good because they're really focusing on, they're specialists on the jack pine.
Okay, so they're finding their food
larvae.
on the jack pine.
Right, exactly. They're foraging on the pines.
Yeah, the bluebird wouldn't, of course.
Right, right. So they were doing fine, but even at that, it was so darn dry there and hot that we were just, you know, hypothesizing that the birds had moved elsewhere where food was maybe not as limited. Yes?
I'm trying to figure out what happens with 25-year-old stand of jack pine that it's not attractive anymore. Is there too much canopy or?
Yeah, I think so. Basically, one of the ways that people have talked about it is that by the time the trees get above that age, they basically self-prune the lower branches, and the birds really like these lower branches that are close to the ground. That's one of the theories that's thrown out there. Whatever it is, their selection image for those stands is for these younger stands.
And what would be a minimum size for an attractive large area? I hear you talking about 400 acres.
Yeah, and I think my guess is they would nest on a 50-acre stand, but only if that 50-acre stand is surrounded by 1,000 acres of pines that are maybe a little older or a little younger, and more like 3,000 acres. Every place I go that I see these guys, you look everywhere you look for a mile. There's no pines that are taller than 20 feet. And that's what they focus on. I think they like these big open areas. Yes.
Do you anticipate that the current fire going up in Douglas, Bayfield counties is likely to create some good nucleus of?
I think there's real potential. I'd like to know more about that. I heard on the radio, but I don't know where it's located. I think I know about where it is, and there is great habitat there. So yes, it should regenerate.
And I think I heard 40,000 acres is good burn.
Wow, that's huge. The big question is what the regeneration is like. This is one of the problems with jack pine. They don't always come back thick, or they don't always come back right away. Yeah.
Two questions. Do they need proximity to open water? And second question is, what's happening with them in the Upper Peninsula?
Okay, first question, no, as far as I can tell, there's no open water that's required. They do quite well on these, really hot, dry stands. And in the UP, like I said, they've been there since '95, so it's been quite a long time. And I would observe, they seem to be back at the same 6 or 8 sites and never really a lot of birds at any one point. There's been 20 to 30 birds in the UP for the last 15 years. Never more, never less. And so there's a couple of spots that are pretty good, but they never really seem to take off. And I think it's because those stands are not as productive as the stand right here in central Wisconsin. We're at a latitude where our productivity, I think, is higher than up there. That's my own theory. I have no basis other than my gut feeling.
What size wire do you have on the top of those traps?
It's like fence wire. I think it's like 2 inches by 4 inches. That you buy in the
poultry wire?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's like a rectangular mesh, and that's that's enough that those cowbirds can drop right, just as it's on the top.
And it has to be on a slant, in other words.
Yeah, it's usually put in like in a little roll like this, so it's kind of a, you know, in a long way like this, so that there's just a slot down the center of the trap where birds can go in. And then the rest of the, remainder of the trap is chicken wire or quarter-inch mesh or whatever. Yes?
What's the wintering habitat like in the Bahamas, and is there active management of that?
That's a great question. The wintering habitat in the Bahamas, and I used to have a piece on that in this presentation, but I took it out because I didn't want it to go too long, you know. But basically, the habitat they utilize in the Bahamas is like dense, scrubby brush, you know, like shrubs. And it's incredibly dense, you know, 5 to 10 feet tall, a lot of berry-producing shrubs. And, you know, those banded birds from the Bahamas that have been coming back to Wisconsin are part of a study, or there was a study down there where they were banding birds and then mounting them with little transmitters so they could map their habitat and find out how much they're actually utilizing. And they would have, again, little 5 to 10 acre plots that they would localize in, and that's where they were wintering. And so, yes, there has been a much greater awareness. There's actually a member of the Bahamas, I don't know what their natural resource agency, who's a member of the recovery team. He comes to our recovery team meetings every year, and they have been doing some management for that down there. There's much greater awareness, and they're actually building, you know, functionality with their natural resource college students down there. Yes?
Have you determined what cowbirds taste like?
No, I haven't. I suspect they taste like chicken. When I was a kid, I ate little birds and, you know, they're breakfast. Blackbirds.
What's the role of males in incubation?
None. None. You'll feed the female, they bring the female food in the nest. They do that, and that's one of the ways you can find the nest is the male will actually bring the female.
Do you think that the lower estimate of females is simply because they're harder to spot?
There very well could be. They're maybe more subject to predators too. You know, they're doing all the incubation, that's the case with ducks. But they very well could be. They're like almost invisible. You know, unless they have a nest, gosh, they're hard to see. They really are. And that's pretty dense stuff out there. Yeah.
If an individual or an organization wanted to contribute to this effort, what would be the best route?
Okay, I guess I would suggest the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. They have a bird protection fund, and then some of that money goes to the Kirtland's project. Yes.
How long do they live for? Do you have a recording what they sound like?
Yeah, I had one in the beginning. I can play this again. And I think the oldest bird recorded is something like 11 years. But, you know, it's kind of like, what's the average age? Well, the average age is probably like 2 or 3, but we had two of the 7 birds that we had banded the first year. 2 of them returned yet this last year, so, and they were banded actually as, one of them I know was an AHY, so he was at least 2 years old at that time. So that one is like 7 years old as of last year. So we have a good number of birds that are 3, 4, 5 years old right now in our population. Yes?
Isn't that site, the site down here in Adams County, is that the only site that's produced chicks in the state?
No, they nested successfully up in Marinette County in one year.
And how about Upper Michigan, did they produce, I know you said.
Yeah, they do, you know, their monitoring in Michigan is not nearly the same intensity that we have here, you know. There has been some work done, not being done currently. John Probst was a Forest Service employee with the Forest Experiment Station, Rhinelander. He was a recovery team member and did a lot of work on Kirtland's. He would be the guy I would ask that to, but I'm pretty sure he did document, you know, successful nesting in the UP. But it's much less intensive than what we're trying to do here.
I'm sure that if there's some more questions, people.
Yeah, feel free to
will-
ask me, yeah. Come on up there.
Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause.